Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Walter Veit. He's a lecturer or assistant professor in philosophy at the University of Reading, where he is also the director of the PPE program as well as the philosophy MA program. And today we're talking about his book, A Philosophy for the Science of Animal Consciousness. So, Dr. Veit, welcome to the show. It's a huge pleasure to have you on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
Okay, so the a philosophy for the science of animal consciousness. What is the premise of your book?
Good. Um, so, in the last years, we've seen a bit of an explosion in interest by consciousness research in the question of animal consciousness. Whereas in the past, it was more of a side discussion, or maybe chimpanzees are conscious, maybe corvids, some birds are very clever, perhaps they could have it. The literature has really shifted towards more of a recognition. Well, we don't have to be skeptical necessarily, we can actually investigate it. But that transition is only happening quite slowly. And the premise of the book is essentially that we need a complete perspective shift, where instead of investigating consciousness in humans and then applying our theories, models, tests to other animals, really start with something like a bottom-up approach instead. Shift it all around and think about, well, what are the most minimal forms of consciousness we could imagine in very different systems from us that perhaps in us we wouldn't even consider as consciousness, and think about how could they gradually evolve to get a better understanding of this very complex phenomenon that still puzzles us in consciousness research.
And in your view, and because we're going to talk about the also how scientists approach consciousness, what has the science of consciousness been focused on?
Good. Most of the research has focused on vision, which makes a lot of sense because tests of vision are much more reliable. You can test the same kind of experimental procedures in other labs. If you think of other domains like, say, smell, sound, hearing, or affective states, pleasures, how much you enjoy something, the painfulness of pain, how intense is it? It's much harder in that case to actually be sure that what people report in experiments actually reflects their experiences. Whereas in vision, it's very easy to test whether people have actually seen something, because if they haven't, they wouldn't be able to report it, right? And so, because of the ease of focusing on vision, as well as because we've evolved to be an incredibly visually acute species, we have really good eyes compared to most mammals. It just, for us as humans, because we're so visually focused, made sense to study that domain the most. And so what you see in a lot of theorizing about consciousness is that a lot of the theoretical work is based on vision. You read some older books, say, Consciousness Explained by Dan Dennett and so forth. There's a lot of focus on visual illusions. It's not that much talk about other domains of conscious experience.
And so, what do you think we might be lacking, or we need to, or that we need to make progress in the scientific study of consciousness?
Right. So we definitely need to think about the evolution of consciousness. And I think there's still a lot of resistance to this, because most people think of consciousness as all or nothing property. It's either there or not. It's like a light switch. It's on or off. Someone is conscious or they are not. Humans, maybe that seems a bit plausible. I mean, either you have experiences of some kind or there's none. And yet, maybe if you think about states where you lose some conscious capacities, you lose some sensory capacities, perhaps you're blinded and so forth, or you enter a kind of dreamlike experience, maybe it makes sense more to speak of these experiences as diminished forms of consciousness. And that gives us a little bit of purchase of, well, what would it be like if you think about consciousness evolving gradually from no experiences at all to some sort of experiences? What could these quasi experiences be like? That from our perspective, we would need to perhaps really describe as conscious or not conscious, but something very strange. Think of life. It's very hard to think about the origin of life, because what would be these systems? What would these systems be like that are neither alive nor not alive, but something in between, where they have some of these properties in not as reliable fashion. They're kind of gradually there, and these systems are getting better and better at being more reliable and having these properties. And something similar, I think, is needed in the case of consciousness. We need to think about the most minimal forms and think about how they've gradually gotten there.
And so, in what ways do you think that an evolutionary, or as you call it in the book, a Darwinian program towards animal consciousness is defensible? I mean, why is it a good enough framework to approach such a phenomenon as consciousness?
Well, for all complex biological traits, they've evolved at some point. Complex traits don't just pop into existence, because it would need too many changes in the genes to make that happen. So by some accidents, something might work, like, say, an additional arm in an insect. Maybe that works out in some case. Some additional claw, say, on an appendix or so forth. That might pay off. That might be just one gene change. But for consciousness, a really complex trait that is incredibly well fitted to what actually goes on in the world. Illusions are actually pretty rare. It's designed in a way in which we can deal with the world in better ways. It presents us the most important information from an evolutionary perspective in a useful way that we can interact with it. And so to think that consciousness must have been the sudden property that just came into being at some point, well, yes, then you'll think of consciousness as this almost magical property that will elude explanation forever. But here evolution is really the solution, because it enables us to think about consciousness in a very different way, and then can resolve these explanatory gaps, the hard problem of consciousness, and really dissolve these problems. Not entirely, because as we look at the history of any biological trait and its evolutions, there can often be gaps, right? We don't have all the fossil evidence. And of course, with consciousness, it's very hard to fossilize, obviously. And so we need to think much more about the evolution of the nervous system, the evolution of muscles, and certainly the origins of the nervous system came into being in order to control muscles. And so it helps us, I think, to think about the brain isn't just this independent thing, just engaged in information processing, representing the world, but originally it evolved to control a complex system, enable it to engage in action selection, doing the right thing at the right time. And the key then here to understand consciousness is, what role did consciousness have in enabling us to have better action selection, the kind of animals at the very origin of consciousness? How did consciousness help them?
Okay, so, and do you have any idea about that? I mean, in your view, what would have been the evolved functions of consciousness?
Good. So obviously my hypothesis about the origin of consciousness could be wrong without invalidating my arguments for an evolutionary approach. But I argue that the origins of consciousness lie in evaluation. And the argument, I make several arguments for that, but one fundamental one is that for something to pay off, for an evolutionary investment, it inevitably has to bear out some fitness advantage. And so for a trait like consciousness that should influence our actions, it ultimately must impact how decisions are made. And so if you think about conscious properties like particular types of sensory experience, especially on the visual side, it's often very, it does raise the question of, well, clearly it would be possible to just engage in information processing without having this happen in a conscious manner. So what is the additional benefit here? And I get here the sense of the heart problem. I feel it myself. But as, for instance, Mark Solms has argued, that is not as much the case if you think about the evaluative side. Evaluation does seem to elude it a bit. At least the explanatory gap becomes smaller if you think about, well, if these systems are engaged in complex evaluations, and then we ask, well, why are they happening in a conscious manner? It's less question begging, at least. Where here, it does make sense that because conscious evaluations evolved at some point, it's plausibly here where animals have started to deal with these very complex action selection problems. And the framework I've developed, I've called the pathological complexity thesis. You can also think of life history complexity, where to explain it, it's probably good to use some economic terms. It's essentially decision theory applied to biological systems, where just like with a company, you could ask, well, a company wants to maximize profit. We can make different investments, say into more production facilities or more workers. Maybe we invest into more cars to deliver food somewhere. You have Amazon maybe, and instead of investing just into bicycles to deliver packages, maybe you need some larger trucks and so forth. And so similarly, from an evolutionary perspective, different species have life history strategies in order to optimize their eventual reproductive output. And you can make investments into, say, longer claws, a faster metabolism, and all of these investments trade off against each other. And so whenever we take something of, you might have heard of adaptationist critiques with several of your guests, where sometimes adaptationism is criticized for just treating the organism like a Swiss Army knife. You just add something on and you look at the benefits of that. But all of these traits trade off against each other. If you invest into one thing, you can't invest all of that energy somewhere else. And so thinking about life history from a very broad perspective to include all these organismal trade-offs, we can think of different species as having implemented different life history strategies in this complex ecological world, shared with other species, in order to maximize reproductive output. And so when you have that, there's an optimality function you have to solve. And the idea is that I defend here, and also draws on some earlier work, say, especially by Michel Cabernet, who has argued that pleasure could constitute a common currency of decision-making, where I argue, yes, this affective side of experience plausibly is the very origin of consciousness, which helped organisms to make better decisions in dealing with these trade-offs. Because, of course, for organisms, they do not have anything like a mathematical abstraction where they have all the values of these different properties. When they start to have to make decisions in their own lives, natural selection cannot solve that for them. They need to make the decisions there in the moment, and a natural selection will select for something akin to fitness, a kind of common currency with which to make better decisions. And the idea is that consciousness has played a crucial role here in enabling very early organisms around the Cambrian explosion to make better decisions.
And so, if I understood it correctly, hedonic evaluation would have been the most basic kind of subjective experience. Is that it?
Yes. And the idea is that that could have existed prior to any sensory experiences. Now, sometimes I've gotten some criticism of this idea, saying, well, clearly you need senses in order to make decisions, because what are you making evaluations between? But you don't need sensory experience necessarily. You just need sensory information that comes in. As long as a particular feel comes along with whatever you're doing at the moment, and you just continue doing that, that could explain the very origins. You can think of almost like bacteria when they have to make decisions between, oh, do I keep swimming in this direction or this one? This can be solved in a very easy mechanistic manner. You just check for whether the particular chemicals you're interested in are decreasing or are getting higher, and then you change your directions depending on that. But for animals, when you have a complex multicellular body engaging in a much more complex world with much more complex decisions, eventually these kind of very fixed responses just won't be as useful anymore. You need more flexibility, and this hedonic form of evaluation can then also be updated based on experiences.
Oh, okay. So we need also to talk here a little bit about phenomenological complexity, because if we're talking about consciousness and the subjective aspect of consciousness, we have to talk about phenomenology, right? So what is phenomenological complexity, and why does it matter in the study of consciousness?
Right. So I introduced the term phenomenological complexity as almost like a replacement for consciousness, because philosophers, especially like David Chalmers, Thomas Nagel, often talk about consciousness as this all or nothing matter, and that has influenced a lot of scientists now. I think it has almost taken a life on its own, especially if you think about qualia. It's very hard to think about that existing in a gradual manner. And I wanted to emphasize, look, phenomenology is actually very complex. There's a lot of different properties and dimensions we can identify. And if you just imagine different kinds of organisms, their kind of distribution in this space, however we want to map this out, depending on more or less dimensions, could look radically different. If you think about AI systems, could be even more different, right? We perhaps so dissimilar, we would have no idea what kind of experience that even would be. But at least for animals, because we have a common evolutionary history and this need for hedonic evaluation, at least this is plausibly common to all animals.
So, I mean, sorry for interrupting that, but so we have to, or it's rigorous, I guess, to assume a phylogenetic diversity of consciousness, right? That there's a variety and gradation both within and across species.
Exactly. So if you think about just the diversity of animals we see in nature, talking about the mobile ones, the flexible ones that make decision making, not necessarily jellyfish. I don't think consciousness is present there. There's such diversity. It would be absurd to think that consciousness wouldn't be similarly diverse in these different species. And the idea then of the framework is to really try to map out this phenomenological complexity and explain it in terms of this pathological complexity. What are the particular life history challenges faced by different species? And that helps us then to map out, give plausible predictions for what the experiences might be like, without just telling just so stories, without just providing hypotheses that aren't grounded in anything. No, this is based in the very best data then we have about the lives these animals live. What are the strategies they're implementing? And based on that strategy, it's much easier than to think about, well, what kind of experience would be worth having here rather than not? Wouldn't it be cheaper to not have this capacity for, say, a rich experience across time? If all of the decisions you have to make are very much in the present, perhaps an experience of time won't be as important. Where if you look at squirrels, corvids, ravens, magpies and the like that have to hide nuts and want to retrieve them perhaps months later and need to remember hundreds, if not thousands of items, here an experience of time is plausibly very useful to remember where, when, and what was hidden.
Right. And so, I mean, in terms of phenomenological complexity, can we really ever investigate it, or the phenomenological complexity of animal consciousness, which is what we're talking about here, if we only have direct access to human consciousness? I mean, why shouldn't, in terms of subjective experience, of course, why shouldn't human consciousness be the only kind worth exploring?
Good. So certainly human consciousness plays an important role. And I don't deny that it made sense originally to start with humans. I mean, medicine in many ways started with humans. But similarly, medicine, biology made rapid progress once we moved away from just studying the human body and, say, studying mice, rats, and a wide variety of other animals. That gave us a much better understanding of physiology. And the behaviorists pointed this out very early, where psychology was very much focused on human consciousness, human behavior, but almost no attention whatsoever given to animals. Now, the behaviorists have a bad reputation now, but what they really tried to do is emulate what they saw as the reason for Darwin's success. That is, instead of explaining biological phenomena by appealing to internal forces, life force and elan vital, you thought about the world of the living in an externalist manner, with natural selection being this external force that changes these systems rather than change just by the internal dynamics. And so similarly, they thought, well, depending on external environmental conditioning, behavior can be radically transformed. Now, I think that's mistaken in the sense that that's not the only thing Darwin did. In fact, you can think about Darwinism in a much more internalist way, where there's internal trade-offs between different properties. And what's much more important is this dynamic with systems embedded in the natural environments. That's the mistake behaviorists made. They study these systems apart from the environments they've evolved in. And the nephologists like Konrad Lorenz and the like corrected for this. And one of the driving ideas of the book is that we need to do the same thing then for consciousness. We need to think about the natural environments in which consciousness evolved. And our human environments have changed radically over the last hundreds of years, even the last decade with AI. I mean, I think the next 50 years will have radical changes in terms of how human societies are structured, what our lives are going to be like. But of course, natural selection doesn't have the time to change our conscious experiences to be ideal for these environments. No, it's lagging behind. And so when we study human consciousness, we are studying it like the behaviorists studied behavior, almost apart from these natural environments. There's often then a disconnect. But for wild animals, that's not the case. It might be different maybe for some species that have evolved now for very much the kind of human environment. Take pigeons, rats living in the sewers of New York, say. But if we actually manage to study animals in the wild and understand what their lives are like, that gives us a much better understanding. And of course, the experimental paradigms we've developed in order to test human consciousness apart from just asking for self-report, they are still very useful because they can help us to validate these predictions. So if you just look at an animal and it turns out this animal is actually hiding a lot of food for the future, now we can predict that based on the importance of this within the life history strategy, let's evaluate how important that actually is for the reproductive output. Based on that, we can then predict it would make sense for a conscious experience across time to exist here. We can make comparative analyses versus other animals that are hiding food, like corvids. How significant is that for their fitness? And based on that, we can make predictions, and that can then be tested, right? We can have experimental paradigms. Nikki Clayton at the University of Cambridge has done a lot of experimental work on this, where we can try to understand, well, how rich are the time travel, the mental time travel capacities of these animals? And it could turn out that our hypotheses are wrong, of course. But insofar as consciousness evolved and evolved for something, it makes sense that if a particular rich form of experience wouldn't have any payoff in an animal's life, it wouldn't make sense for it to exist.
Hmm.
Um, and so, if, say, a species changes its lifestyle, maybe it stops engaging in any kind of hiding of food for the future. We would expect then the experiences to diminish over time with natural selection acting against these rich memory capacities. And of course, in humans, in our own species, we see radical differences in a conscious experience. Think of neurodiversity, say, but the experience of time. One of my motivations actually was to point out, look, if animals are so radically different in their experience from us, that helps us to recognize how diverse experience can be in our own species. And a lot of the philosophical writing um, before the last 50 years, it was very heavily focused on the kind of self-experiment studies where people introspected into their own conscious experience, tried to generalize that then across all humans, that whatever their experiences are, that can be generalized. But then you
Hmm.
have things like Hume, who says, well, there's not really any connection between my experience at this point or the future. Maybe he just had aphantasia. Maybe he didn't make this connection.
Yeah.
Um, where and I think that helps us. And so, yes, studying human experience is important, um, but the animal case helps us to contextualize where it came from, what its purpose is, and in order to understand complex biological features, we need to understand their functions.
Right. So, just to clarify one point that you made there, I think it's a very important point of clarification to make here. So, I mean, when you mentioned that over the past few hundred years and even the past decade, our conscious experiences have changed. So, when you propose a Darwinian approach to consciousness in your book, you're extending or going beyond the original conception of Darwinism, right? I mean, you're including things that perhaps other people would include in the so-called extended evolutionary synthesis, and particularly things like cultural evolution, correct?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I certainly, in a way, saw it more as an extension of Darwin himself in the origin, where
Okay.
maybe now um, we haven't really thought much about evolution of consciousness, and it was more restricted. But if you look at Darwin and his protege Romanes, they wrote a lot about evolution of mind. They didn't restrict natural selection, and I very much see that as an extension. And if you think about them, the way people now want to extend Darwinian thinking towards a broader synthesis, perhaps. There's two ways of thinking about this. One is where you think, well, Darwinism itself is limited and needs to be supplanted with other forces. And another way of thinking about it is, look, no, we can extend Darwinism itself more broadly, where you might think of cultural evolution as a Darwinian process fundamentally. Um, and I'm very much on the Darwinian side here, actually. I don't think
Okay.
we necessarily need radically different models. There's a lot of things that haven't been given enough attention. I think that's right. Development, culture, and so forth. Um, but I'm not sure how much that would be of a radical evolution necessarily, rather than just an expansion of the original framework.
Okay. And I mean, when it comes to approaching consciousness from an evolutionary perspective, how much should we assume it in other species? I mean, or when should we assume that it should exist in a particular species? Or what is the kind of a theoretical or empirical exploration that we should do before uh, arriving there at the conclusion that probably a particular species also has consciousness?
Good. So, of course, if you think about phenomenological complexity, we'll want to start asking about what the experiences are like, perhaps instead of consciousness on or off, But once we've transformed the original question towards more of a recognition, look, there could be much more minimal forms of subjective experience than human consciousness. I don't think the word is as loaded anymore. So part of me thinks, well, the term consciousness has so much baggage now, it would almost be better to not use it. But of course, that is the thing we're interested in. Human consciousness is so incredibly complex. There's a mystery here, and we want to understand it. Why do we have this mysterious, complex property? And so, yes, if we want to look at animals, we want to understand what these properties are, and if it's true that, as I say, hedonic experience is plausibly the most original form, then that's what we want to look at in order to figure out whether these animals have experiences or not. So if you look at boundary cases like insects, gastropods, slugs, snails, you wouldn't want to focus too much on the sensory side. Obviously, they have sensory capacities. They need them. That doesn't necessarily mean they have sensory experiences. But what you really want to focus on is how rich are their evaluative capacities. How many trade-offs can they make beyond several inputs of importance, where you might think, well, in order to access food in a particular location, you have to be exposed to a very high heat. And they've done some experiments with bumblebees, for instance, that have been able to make very fine-grained trade-offs, where they've changed the temperature as well as the value of the food solution, sucrose. And depending on that, these bumblebees made really good decisions of whether it was worth going there or not. Clearly, it was aversive to them. And similarly, there's really good experiments with painkillers that work in humans, but also work in insects. Not all of them do. But we can find, for instance, that they can help these insects to overcome particular environments that would otherwise be too aversive. There's really interesting work done by Megan Barrett, who's pointed out a lot of the surprising findings about how complex the evaluations of insects can be. And so that's the kind of experimental evidence we want to look at in order to understand what the actual evaluative experiences are like. But at least in my framework, the interesting boundary cases are definitely insects and gastropods, small slugs and snails. I think this is where we'll have difficult decisions to make about whether consciousness is present there.
Do you think that it will be possible to break or to solve the hard problem of consciousness scientifically or even philosophically? Because, of course, when it comes to that step that we need to take from, for example, studying neural correlates of consciousness or studying how certain kinds of brain activity in certain specific regions or areas of the brain correlate with consciousness or with particular kinds of conscious experiences. But taking the step from that to qualia and subjective conscious experience, I mean, how do we do that? And do you think it's possible to do it scientifically or philosophically?
Right. Yeah, I definitely think we can solve it in a scientific manner. And well, you have some people like Dan Dennett who got close to denying any kind of subjective experience entirely with the arguments against qualia. I don't like that argumentative approach too much because it allows the critics that think, oh, consciousness will never be scientifically explained to simplify their views too much and strawman them, where I think what Dennett was actually interested in is think about consciousness like free will. We have these preconceived conceptions, but as we learn more about this phenomenon, our understanding of consciousness itself can radically change. Whereas he thought of qualia more as a pre-scientific notion of consciousness. And so
So that would be a sort of illusionist approach to consciousness.
That's right. So consciousness does seem to have these properties that are very important, but they might be more like illusions. And I don't like the word illusion too much because, I mean, as people like David Chalmers point out, if you have an illusion experience, that's still an experience. So it wouldn't matter too much. But there is a kind of user illusion where, in order to use a smartphone well, the information is presented to you in a very handy manner. And so in Germany, we call mobile phone handy, actually. Which is but I think that is a helpful way of thinking about it, that evolution didn't just give us all the information around us and then we can do with that whatever we want. No, of course, computational systems want to have bottlenecks and need to make decisions in much more efficient manners, filter out all the information that isn't important. And to some extent, the hard problem invites the idea that, look, there's something fundamental here that cannot be bridged. Peter Godfrey Smith emphasizes the term explanatory gap. Because of that, it's better to think of making a gap smaller, building bridges across it. And similarly to many of the questions that people in evolutionary biology are interested in, including myself, think of the origins of many traits. We're not offering an explanation where we give you evidence for each and every step that happened, but we give plausible models, theories based on the evidence that they get as close as possible to that in order to reconstruct it, make sense of it. And if we can make sense of the evolution of consciousness, that would then radically reduce this mystery of consciousness. It wouldn't resolve it entirely. I mean, even if we have if we have settled the question of which hypothesis on the origin of life is the most accurate, most well supported by evidence, I still will have a kind of mystery of just imagining the kind of scenario, thinking about it, how it happened. Then it will be helpful to look at, say, models, visualizations of that. They can be very helpful in reducing this kind of psychological gap, right? It's not easy even to think in mathematical models. And of course, that is where science is moving towards. It's harder to think about that because most we didn't evolve to be a very mathematical species. It's actually surprising that we are as good at it as it might appear, although I do think that part of the reason there is that our species actually underwent another explosion in pathological complexity once we started to engage in barter and trade, which increased this complexity of our decisions much more again. And then actually hedonic evaluation didn't pay off as well anymore. You needed a new form of evaluation, a more slower, a more abstract form of evaluation, which I think led to a more kind of symbolic evaluation, where we then were able to think of future outcomes, not in terms of how they feel to us in the moment. This hedonic way of being isn't too useful there. And I think that's where we get this distinction between people just living this hedonic lifestyle, where they just think of, just do whatever feels best in the moment. And no, we can step away from this to some extent, right? Not always. Sometimes the pizza is too alluring. Now today, everything's very easy. You can have Uber Eats, Deliveroo, food can arrive by just pressing a few buttons. Of course, now it's easier for humans to be overweight, say, because this access for food that wouldn't have been possible in the past. I mean, for our ancestors, we couldn't have had food just around us at any second. And so I think the evolutionary perspective is incredibly useful here to help us reshape the entire problem. Because, of course, that's what often happens in evolutionary biology. We had these problems that it seemed utterly mysterious, the evolution of flight, the evolution of the eye. But through careful analysis, the evidence, thinking through plausible evolutionary scenarios, modeling them, comparing alternatives, we actually started to make sense of it. And it doesn't mean that some things will still seem very complex, but it won't have this utterly mysterious magic notion to it, right? It won't be like going to a magic show, someone pulls a rabbit out of a hat, and you just think, how did that happen? I can't explain it. No, you will have some purchase on the explanation. It won't be a complete mystery, not a complete feat of magic, but it will still be very difficult to understand.
Yes, but there's that sort of thought experiment. I can't remember exactly the name of the thought experiment, but I'm going to describe it. It's basically a woman, a female scientist who lives in a room. She has no experience of color, but she learns everything that is to be learned, that there is to be learned about color through science. I mean, she reads about the neuroscience, the cognitive science, the psychology, the physics of color. And then she comes out of the room and she experiences the color for the first time. In that case, I think it's the color red, but it can be any other color. And I mean, people say that when she experiences the color red directly, she learns something about the color red that she could never have learned even by reading all the science there is to be read about it. I mean, that, and so do you think that there is something about conscious experience that cannot be captured in scientific terms or even by language more generally?
No, I think that's a really interesting thought experiment. And of course, it kind of assumes that a human would have infinite capacity to absorb knowledge. And I think that's a problem of the thought experiment, because what would it mean to know all the scientific facts about something? Science never uncovers all the facts. We just try to pick and choose what are the best puzzles to make further progress on, to alleviate the mysteries. And so clearly in the case of the origin of life, it's no longer a mystery. We have some good understanding of possible mechanisms by which it could have happened. And similarly with consciousness, you can think about, well, is there a mystery here? Is there any kind of experience we can't make sense of? And I'm not so sure that that is the case. I mean, it is hard to understand, to take the perspectives of other people. I once met a nurse who was able to smell diseases, and she discovered that because she was hanging around patients that had the same conditions again and again, but then she noticed that same smell in her husband, and she took him to a doctor who then indeed identified the earliest signs of that disease. And not only did she have this incredible sense of smell, but she would actually see those smells as color experiences in her subjective experience. And so, can I fully grasp what that would be like? Hard to say. I think if you want to think about whether science can fully resolve consciousness in the sense of we would know exactly what that experience is like, it's, I think, asking more than we ask from any other science. We don't ask economists to be able to predict exactly the price of an ice cream down the line. No, we give you predictions that we try to make as accurate as possible. We try to give explanations of the past that capture the plausible mechanisms as well as possible. And by doing so, the natural world, the social world have become less mysterious. And it's largely thanks to the natural and social sciences that is the case. Whereas in the past, people would have drawn much more on magic, oracles, and the like. It's all mysterious, all just luck. And in order to deal with this utter complexity, maybe that's more comforting because, well, it's not just incredibly complex system that interacts with other systems. No, it's more simple. It's all maybe fate or maybe something you've done in a past life that influences what happens to you now. Maybe this is more simple to think about. We don't like complexity. We evolved to find easy solutions. If there's alternative complex explanations, we try to go for the simplest ones. The simplest ones aren't always the correct ones, of course. The simplest explanation with consciousness might be it's an all or nothing matter. It's like a magic spark that just happened to pop into existence at some point. If you then ask for the explanation of how that's possible, of course, you couldn't explain that in a simple way. So what maybe you need to then think of the physical world existing next to a non-physical one, imbued with soul-like properties, a different world entirely. Panpsychists think of the world like this, or the dualists, but I don't think that's the best explanation. I think they want simplicity almost in the answer, but it's not that simple. And we need to really understand the natural world much better. But once we've done it, once we made progress here, we try to combine the insights from evolutionary biology with all the science, from the neurosciences, cognitive sciences, and so forth. I think we make a lot of progress on it. And it's just not that mysterious anymore. Doesn't mean no one promises that it won't still seem strange, that there still will seem something a bit magical about it. I still think of the origin of life as something quite magical myself, but not magical in a sense that resists explanations in terms of natural processes and mechanisms.
Yeah, I mean, not magical in the sense that, for example, if you think about the process of fertilization, I mean, maybe someone religious would think, oh, so in that moment where an egg meets a sperm cell and they fuse, there's something above human, there's
Right.
something magical, something mystical, divine happening there that sparks life into existence. But I mean, if you approach it from purely a scientific perspective, we actually have a very good understanding of that process, and it doesn't have to involve that kind of language, right?
Right. Yeah, and because we have now these explanations, it seems that the need for the more magical, Mysterian type of explanations kind of disappears. Why do you need to still rely on those? I think part of the motivation is that we want the magic to stay there. I mean, even if you think about life, wouldn't it be nice for life to be this incredible magic-like property in natural world? But you don't have to think about it in supernatural forms. Life in the universe is incredibly unique. We're incredibly lucky. Of all the organisms that ever lived, only very few managed to reproduce, and we have a long lineage of very lucky ancestors. And I still sense the magic in that. It's almost more magical because it wasn't fated. No, that is hard-fought survival.
Yeah, right. So I would like to ask you specifically about the example of gastropods and the challenge of arthropods, which is something that you talk about in your book. I mean, why are these classes of animals important? I mean, what do they tell us, and what kinds of challenges do they pose to studying and understanding consciousness?
Good. So Peter Godfrey Smith, in his book Metazoa, raises the possibility that we could have a distinct evolution of different types of conscious experience, where things maybe in insects, because they seem to not respond to horrific injuries in any way like we would, or other mammals, other birds and reptiles and so forth. Well, maybe not all reptiles. I mean, obviously they can lose a tail and they just keep living. But that it might seem, look, they have rich sensory capacities. You have these jumping spiders that have very acute, very incredibly good sensory capacities with which to catch their prey. But then with gastropods, it does seem a bit different, where their sensory capacities seem to be significantly poorer, their eyes are much worse, but it does seem like they're much more responsive to injuries. They're doing evaluations. And so Peter raised this as a possibility that, well, maybe there could have been an independent evolution, and it doesn't have to be something like hedonic evaluation, perhaps as a necessary core of consciousness.
Mhm.
And I certainly think that if we think of AI systems, maybe that could be the case, that we create a kind of subjective experience completely detached of hedonic experience. I'm not so sure that's actually true, but we just know very little about AI systems and what would be perhaps a necessary feature of conscious experience. I'm very hesitant to say that because in biology, it's very rare to have anything like an essence. For any process, you find exceptions. Things are much more gradual, multidimensional. So the same is probably very much true for consciousness. However, in a consciousness case, I think this is a good test for the pathological complexity thesis, that consciousness evolved in order to deal with this life history complexity to enable organisms to make better decisions. If it's truly the case that sensory consciousness could have evolved first, that would be very good evidence against it. And if you look at insects, it actually turns out they can make complex evaluations. It's just they care about different things. They care about things like thirst and hunger. That seems to be quite aversive to them. Things like a heated platform. But damage to the body, not so much. And perhaps that's because they have a very different biological design, right? They're essentially as if we were wearing a knight's armor and walking around with that.
Yeah.
If you are a medieval knight and you fight in that and someone else hits you with a club or sharp sword, doesn't matter that much whether now you have a dent in your armor, right? You keep on living. And so it wouldn't be that beneficial to, I'd imagine, for a knight to feel incredible pain when they take a dent in the armor, right? I think that's nice to visualize. And similarly for insects, what benefit would it derive there? And of course, they live very fast lives, typically much faster in terms of life cycles than us. And as long as you manage to reproduce, it doesn't matter as much whether you get injured. And if you take insects like social colonies, if you have worker bees, ants, and so forth, that don't themselves reproduce, of course, in that case, it doesn't matter what happens to you, as long as you can sacrifice your life. So the whole hive stays alive, or the ant colony. In that case, it doesn't matter. And yet still in bees, we find very rich capacities for evaluation, which is plausibly driven by the complex decisions they have to make in terms of how far do you fly to pursue better resources. Perhaps there's flowers further down the line where you can find more, or do you go on the quickest trip? And so there's complex economic decisions they have to make. They're communicating with other bees that are giving new information. Come here, they're doing a little dance. You might have heard of this. In order to convey the information and the distance, the value of the resource. Another bee can make a dance and basically communicate, no, over there, that resource is much better. And then they can make decisions. And so even for worker bees, there we can find rich evaluative capacities. Now, bees are more complex in many ways. Because of that, they have quite complex brains. And I would be very hesitant to say that just because bees show evidence for hedonic evaluations, that necessarily all insects must. But once we consider one insect to be a very strong case for having sentience, conscious experience of this evaluative kind, there's a very strong to be made that we now should look for evidence in these other species. Because often it's not so much a lack of evidence, it's just that we haven't looked for it at all.
Okay, so I have two more questions. The first one is, among all, because there's a diversity of scientific theories of consciousness out there, competing to see if any of them finally can solve and completely explain consciousness. I mean, among all of them, do you think that there's any that is closer than all the others to the kind of framework you suggest in your book?
Good. Because I mentioned that often theories try to emphasize one of the dimensions of consciousness as their core and often seem to lack something else, I was hesitant to call my approach a theory of consciousness. It was almost like a framework to think of it differently. And
Okay.
once we think of it through this perspective, we can think of different theories of consciousness, perhaps capturing different aspects of conscious experience. I think one theory
Right.
that gets very close in the human case is the global workspace theory of consciousness. Still too focused on vision, but I think captures quite well how experience operates in the human case. I think it's not as useful if you think about the very origins of consciousness. There you might think something more like Mark Solm's account is useful. Just think of these hedonic evaluations. Similarly to Romanes and Darwin speculated about this in the beginning, that pain and pleasure could be the origins of consciousness. And Michel Cabernet emphasized that quite a bit. So instead of offering, I mean, what are theories? Theories in science often try to give a simple explanation to capture a wide variety of phenomena. And so,
Yeah.
if you think about it that way, of course, it makes sense that different proposals of theories of consciousness try to take one aspect of consciousness, explain that, and then try to generalize that to all of subjective experience. But
Right.
consciousness is incredibly complex. And because of that, I'm reluctant to say that one theory, one simple proposal will capture all of this. I think consciousness is so incredibly complex. It's very plausible that for some unique aspects, especially in human experience, we might offer a completely different explanation of how it works. And of course, it all should come together in the end. It should influence our actions. But especially because we have this divide in the human case between hedonic evaluations and the kind of abstract reasoning evaluations, it's very hard to have something like a unifying theory. You often get these distinctions of thinking fast and thinking slow. It's not like that's
Mhm.
captured in a single theory. We have almost this mishmash of different mechanisms designed by natural selection, one on top of the other. It would be much better perhaps to design things from scratch with one simple mechanism, but we just have these interacting systems. And so for a future theory of consciousness, I expect it to be more like a theory perhaps of biological diversity, where you recognize, look, consciousness is almost as diverse as life itself. But we don't have a theory of all this diversity. We have a theory of how we got this diversity, right?
Mhm.
And I offer a theory of how we get to this diversity in subjective experience. But then to actually explain how particular aspects of that experience work, that might differ depending on the case. Something like dreams might have a very distinct kind of theory behind it in the end. And most of experience we're interested in typically is just the decision making in the moment. I think we can have a quite general theory here in terms of hedonic evaluations, efficient action selection, dealing with trade-offs among these different information domains. In humans, that looks very much like a global workspace. In other animals, perhaps a bit less so. But then there's these other aspects of experience that puzzle us a lot, like dreams, this ability to extend ourselves across time, memories that go back far in time. We just imagine ourselves flying through space. All of these things might require their own explanations. And so, if you think about the criticism of the naturalist approach, that the scientific advance to consciousness, if you ask them, just provide us one simple theory, like, I don't know, a supply and demand theory of the price of ice cream at the beach, you won't get a theory like that of consciousness. It won't look like that. In biology, in the end, in economics, for instance, we don't really have. I studied philosophy and economics in the beginning, so I still I like to use a lot of these metaphors and examples. I think economics is a very good case where people often demand economists to provide you this one unifying theory of everything. But that's not actually how economics progresses. Economics is more like a library of different models that, depending on the context, you can use to understand something much better than before. And if you were to try to integrate all of these models into something like a single theory, you'd actually lose so much that wouldn't be a desirable outcome. And so philosophy of science has moved away from that, at least to some extent, from this goal that in the end we have this one theory. I mean, no one thinks that we'll explain how prices emerge in a particular market in terms of fermions and bosons. No, we have these different levels and different types of models and theories. Maybe if we had infinite capacity to keep to have knowledge, for memory and so forth, maybe we could explain it all in this theory. But we are cognitively limited agents. And so if I imagine the science of consciousness 50 years from now, maybe 100 years from now, I would imagine it rather than a bunch of competing theories. We just have a large library of models, a large variety of more domain-restricted theories that explain these different aspects of consciousness, but they're all contextualized within the context of natural selection, of evolutionary processes that got us there. Because evolution helpfully constrains this library. Because some proposals are just not as plausible from a historical perspective compared to others. And I think that's a problem many people have now. It seems there's so many theories of consciousness. Anyone who wins a Nobel Prize in the end decides, well, I can make a theory of consciousness. No, well, we need evidence to constrain all of these varieties. And I think we can do it. And evolution can really help us, just like it did for all the other complex biological phenomena, to constrain the space, to offer libraries of models, theories, mechanisms that are well understood, that help to reduce the mysteries of the biological world, and consciousness shouldn't be any different.
Okay, so one final question then. This is something that you've already referred to earlier, but in the domain of the philosophy of mind, there are, of course, it's not many people, but there are a few panpsychists. But then there are other people who are less ambitious in terms of their psychism and propose biopsychism. That is psychism that would apply just to the biosphere, just to life and to organism and to all kinds of organisms. So do you look at biopsychism as a problem or not?
Well, I have a similar response to both views, where for the panpsychist, there appears this mystery of consciousness. And if you take it seriously, the idea that consciousness is all or nothing, well, then, of course, it's very difficult to think of it as something that could have evolved by natural selection. Because if you look at a gradual chain of any phenomenon, it's not like we ever get a spot where we say, this is the definite moment where we got the eye, the wing, the brain, life itself. We don't get these moments in biology, really. And so if you think there must be one for consciousness to give an evolutionary explanation, well, then it does start to make sense to think, well, maybe it's been there all along. Maybe it's been there all along. Or alternatively, you just think of it as having popped into existence with life itself. Now, I think that's actually less plausible, because life itself did not pop into existence. Life itself is a gradual, multidimensional phenomenon. You can break that down into various features, like a capacity for reliable reproduction, an ability perhaps to have a metabolism and so forth.
I mean, even the division between the organic and the inorganic, I mean, there's not a completely strict division. It's more like a continuum.
Exactly.
Right.
And so if there's a continuum there and life itself is this graded property, I think that actually undermines the biopsychism a bit, because the biopsychist, I think they're on the right track in thinking we need to think about biology uh, in order to understand consciousness, but they're resistant to the gradualism that is so entrenched to Darwinian evolution. If you were to add this gradualism to biopsychism, I think it would start to make a much more sense. If you just think about minds more generally, without necessarily involving consciousness, I think biopsychism is right. We can see something mind-like once biological systems start to engage with their environments. Whether you describe that as proto-minds or quasi-minds, it doesn't really matter. I mean, we decide where we draw the boundaries here, but what we have to recognize that there's these major transitions and gradual evolutions that get us to more complex forms of that phenomenon. And that happens with consciousness itself, where at the very beginnings of this hedonic evaluation, it's very hard to identify something like subjective experience. It might be more like a buzzing of valence, or something very slightly um, feels more bad. And certainly from a physicalist perspective, it's the way I like to think about it is a kind of hybrid between a functionalist identity theory, where both the components of the brain, the nervous system matter, and the functional organization of what the system does. I think when we combine the merits of both of these physicalist approaches, we have a bit more purchase on the problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so I do think the biopsychists are entirely right that we are far too quick to not recognize the kind of cognition going on in plants and bacteria. I think they're right about that. In fact, that's the same criticism I make with our focus on human consciousness for all of consciousness. Cognition is a natural phenomenon. It's not just one restricted to humans. Humans are a special case. Humans are also a special case for consciousness. So we shouldn't make humans the general model for all of conscious experience. Once we understand consciousness across the natural world, humans will be a very peculiar special case that is very different and perhaps requires additional explanations of why our experiences are so different. But that's different from asking for an explanation of why there's any experience at all.
Mm-hmm. Great. So let's end the interview here, Dr. Veit. The book is again a philosophy for the science of animal consciousness. I, of course, am leaving a link to it in the description of the interview. And where can people find you on the internet?
Sure, if you just type my name and at .com in the end, you'll get to my website. But also, if you just type it on Google, it will be very quickly coming up.
Great. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a really fascinating conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. Those were wonderful questions.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingboard, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Ford, Tiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Librant, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardus France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Dana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bach, Guy Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanes, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismael Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, BR, Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Jos Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugnik, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.